I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to Mike Makowsky, who is the creator and showrunner of Death by Lightning. And in starting off and talking about how you came up with the idea to make this miniseries, I love the fact that you were in Barnes and Noble and it was a buy one get one free table, and
I
you
took
just
it. Yeah,
happened to pick up this book
yeah.
and read it out of curiosity. But it sounds like immediately you became incredibly immersed and just like went deep down the rabbit hole. And with the way that you've told this story of, President Garfield and Guiteau being these two men who eventually cross paths, how did you start to conceptualize the way that you wanted to tell this story?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, that's the structure. It is that parallel structure between these two men, on opposite ends of the American social spectrum or what have you. Like, one of whom is very much a poster boy for the American dream, rises from abject poverty and obscurity purely on merit, is a war hero. He's a Union Major General during the Civil War. He is fiercely intelligent, largely self-taught. He is an outspoken progressive advocate for civil rights and universal public education and civil service reform. And he's a brilliant public speaker. And when he, goes up and steps on the stage at his party's presidential convention in 1880, to nominate an entirely different candidate, he's not even on the ballot. People start standing up in the rafters and shouting, "We want Garfield," because his speech presents such a strong and confident vision for the future of this country, while also reconciling with the complexities of the past, and like it just the kind of speech that you see politicians give so rarely now, but ended up propelling him ostensibly against his will to the presidency. So this, on one end you have this guy who doesn't explicitly court greatness, but has it thrust upon him because he's the best man for the job. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Charles Guiteau, also born into abject poverty, also believes he's destined for something really, really special, but just tries and fails repeatedly at everything he attempts, and just really falls through the cracks of society, but is nonetheless convinced that he will etch his name in the annals of American history in a positive way, and sees a lot of himself in Garfield. So when Guiteau first learns about Garfield's rise, he believes that the two of them are kindred spirits and that he needs to help get Garfield elected, and that once Garfield is elected, that Garfield will meet Guiteau and recognize that they're kind of fellow travelers and offer to invite him into the fold and give him the opportunities that have been denied him up until now in his life. And when he doesn't receive that, he loses his mind. He snaps and believes that he has to now kill this man. And so it's really just about these two guys, their journeys, the way that they complement and contrast one another, and ultimately are fated for this collision course that's going to render both of their legacies largely tragically inert.
And because obviously it's not only history with the outcome of what happens, but also, the first episode opens with a card that tells us the ultimate end of their meeting and their kind of destined fate. And so what was that like then, conceptualizing the pacing and the structure and figuring out how to tell a story where the audience knows a piece of the outcome and the ending of it, but you're kind of going, okay, but this is how I'm going to take you there.
Yeah, but even that wasn't really a given, right? I think most Americans that you would stop on the street wouldn't be able to tell you anything about James Garfield, let alone that he'd been assassinated. So, and it was something that we very much went back and forth talking about whether or not to include a title card or some sort of heads up about what the story was going to be about. But it wouldn't surprise me if 99% of the people that click on the show don't even necessarily know that there is going to be an assassination until the title card. And without that, yeah, I don't know that it really grounds the story in the correct way, but it was very much something that we added pretty late in the process, actually. But yeah, no. I mean, from a tone and I think one thing that I really responded to about Candice Millard's book Destiny of the Republic, which is the book that I picked up at Barnes and Noble, was not that it was written with a lot of explicit levity or mirth, but there is a deeply ingrained situational absurdity to a lot of these events. Not all of them, obviously, but this notion of a man going on stage at a convention and being nominated against his will for the presidency, like that as an absurdist set piece, is kind of irresistible to a writer. Listening to Charles Guiteau's early foibles, his time at the Oneida Free Love Commune, getting expelled and being the one member of the commune who can't really partake of the benefits of such a community because he refuses to do manual labor, so they call him Charlie Get Out. Is funny, Chester Arthur, Roscoe Conkling, these larger than life personalities that nobody today really knows much about at all. Uh, I guess that the biggest liberty and the biggest choice that I kind of had to make was like having fun with it, and giving it a little bit more of a contemporary engine behind it, so that it could speak to modern audiences in a way that feels fresh and relevant and not dusty in the way that potentially some other period shows run the risk of doing.
And with that idea of wanting it to kind of feel fun and have that humor and the lighthearted element, it feels like you've been so specific with all of the details and kind of kept it very historically factual, but kind of been more playful with some of the language or some of the tone. How
Yeah.
did you come up with the idea that that's the place where I can be more creative and playful, and then this will have the structure of history?
Yeah, I wanted to be as factually accurate as I could while taking, most of the dramatic liberties, or probably just about condensing events, or, getting, compositing characters or what have you. But the story's so crazy and all true, so it required very little in the way of invention from a storytelling perspective. And then in terms of what language I was going to put in the characters' mouths, I a lot of it is accurate to like most of Garfield's speech early on is used. I just contemporized a little bit of the language, where appropriate, but yeah, with characters like Conkling and Chester Arthur, I mean, I just tried to have fun. Like when I'm writing, it's like what makes me laugh. There's this one line early on that I know we were at the premiere together. When Roscoe Conkling threatens another delegate, he says, "You can kiss the deputy treasury goodbye, motherfucker," which is not maybe a line that you would be used to seeing in a story like this, but I just remembered, having a really nice time while I was writing it. And at the end of the day, it's like what appeals to you as a writer and what your taste is, like you hope can have a broader appeal outside of yourself. And so but I kind of figured if I was enjoying myself, then maybe uh, a reader or reviewer might enjoy it in the same way.
And there's also that aspect where you get to play around with the public and the private lives of these men. And Nick Offerman's character Chester Arthur is a great example of this, where we kind of see like the brute force and kind of the command that he has and the confidence, but then by episode 2 we see him lonely, drunk, kind of dancing around wearing a
Yeah.
hat and throwing up and kind of feeling really sad and quite lonely and isolated. And so what was that like, getting to really look at, here's the historical transcripts and ideas, but conceptualizing what some of that might look like behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, Chester Arthur was especially fun, and when you have an actor like Nick Offerman playing him, and he was very much the person I had in my head is when I was writing that character. But um, yeah, he's interesting in a lot of ways, and talking about his wild night out with Charles Guiteau, which, spoiler alert, didn't actually happen, or at least to the best of our knowledge, didn't happen. They had probably had a passing familiarity with one another, but it felt like a fun opportunity to get these two amazing actors in a space that you would never imagine them meeting in, and it was one of my favorite scenes in the show to write. But yeah, Chester Arthur's was such a gift from a dramatic perspective, because he has a very very defined arc over the course of the show. He really goes from one end to the exact other. He ends up being president, and when you first meet him, he is chief crony of the New York Roscoe Conkling spoils system. By design, I think all you're really supposed to feel about him in that first episode is that he's like a stock character, right? He's just Conkling's right hand. He's got brass knuckles. He's gonna intimidate and cow people into doing Conkling's bidding. And there's not a lot more nuance to him in that first episode. So at the beginning of the second episode, the joy is having Bradley Whitford, having Blaine just sort of seek him out in the crowd like a homing missile and be like, that guy could be vice president, sure, and then elevating him to the national stage. Like it's like it should feel totally absurd because it was totally absurd in 1880 when that happened. And Nick was a very, very game player from like because he had to sit ostensibly in the background for 2 weeks during this convention and just be a good sport. But we were like, please, like when I first sent him the script, I was like, please just read past the first episode. And he could have been a more generous participant. So
I love that. He has such an incredible arc. And in talking about Shea Wiggum's character with Conkling, I wanted to ask about the detailing of his hair because he
yeah,
has the most spectacular hair. And I know it started out as having a wig built for
yeah,
it, and it's that center part. And my favorite detail is like the one little curl in the middle. But then he ended up asking the hair team to just do it on his natural hair.
yeah.
And I was just interested in, kind of what went into all of that.
He's such a passionate actor who really just likes to immerse completely in his character. He's not method, but he just really, really, really cares. And Conkling had a very specific sartorial expression, very specific hairstyle. I mean, that spit curl, the lavender flashy waistcoat. I mean, he was a peacock in every sense of the word in real life. So I think Michael Wilkinson, our costume designer, really popped off with those costumes. And it's a different version of Shea Wiggum than we're maybe used to experiencing. He plays a lot of tough guys, and Conkling was absolutely that. He was a pugilist. He was a fighter, but he also was a dandy. So it's that fun juxtaposition, and to be able to put Shay in those costumes and give him that spit curl. But yeah, I remember that day on set when he first tried on the wig, and he freaked out. I mean, not in like a bad way, in a great way. He like comes up to me, he's like, Makowsky, like it's gotta be fucking real, man. Like I can't. It's messing with my process. Like, but that's just how he was every day in the best way possible. And he cared so deeply. All of our actors just couldn't have been more dedicated or intellectually curious. All of them read copious amounts of source material on their characters and just really immersed. So very fortunate in that regard.
Because also with Matthew McFadden and his portrayal of Charles Guiteau, one of the great things that the script and his performance bring into it is an empathetic understanding of where he's coming from and kind of why he ends up taking the route that he does. And
Yeah.
just the way that Garfield represents this idea of what he desperately wants in his own life, but just like you said, he keeps falling over, he keeps falling short, and it just never happens. And so, how did you want to kind of capture that earnestness that he constantly has?
Yeah. I mean, certainly Guiteau was mentally ill. I think history, the historical record is very clear in that regard. Uh, but I do think that though we will never sympathize, hopefully, with the notion of picking up arms and assassinating political figures, that there's still like a core window for empathy with someone who is spurned so uh, universally by society when really, really, like, or at least in my conception of Guiteau, like, he cared very, very deeply and wanted to be a part of the solution. He wanted to join the fold and just enact some good on the world. Like he believed in the elevation, not just of himself, but like the common man at large and in the American dream, and was just rebuffed at every turn. He felt things very acutely. His passion, as he says to his sister, would often get the better of him. Uh, People around him didn't really know what to make of it. He was just overzealous to the point of being kind of disturbing and creepy. Uh, and he also, his sister tries to institutionalize him in the first episode, and that is factually accurate as well. Like, but there really weren't mechanisms in place in his era to know how to deal with men like him, and so he was able to slip through the cracks of society and ultimately to destructive ends that you know the whole nation had to pay the price.
I feel like I have to get you to do show and tell with the prop that you said you stole from set as
Oh
well.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I have so on my desk. I was showing you before we started. I did steal the brain. It's that was fun going through Budapest airport security.
I didn't even think about having to travel on a plane with that.
Very yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, they did such an incredible job rendering. I got to actually see the real brain,
Oh wow.
um, which is at a military base in Maryland. I had to get special government permission. It took months of my poor assistant wrangling with government officials to be like, "Can you just take a look at the brain?" And yeah, it's just a weird little piece of. It's really all that's left of poor Charlie Guiteau.
I
Our
also wanted,
brain looks a little bit more like a brain, I would say. You can look up pictures of the real one, and it
yeah,
kind of looks like gefilte fish in a jar. Um, we probably have more lobage on ours.
dramatic license on the brain.
Right? Yeah, that was our biggest liberty.
I also wanted to talk about the way that you built Garfield's relationship with his wife Crete, played by Betty Gilpin, because I know that you read a lot of transcripts and letters that they used to write to each other to kind of like understand a lot of their relationship. And what was very modern of the time is the fact that they very much were intellectual equals. They met at university, and even as he ascends into the presidency, she's still in the room with him for these conversations. And
Yeah.
it's really beautiful to watch all of that. And she's a really formidable force in this story in a lot of ways. And I was interested in how the research kind of really helped you to derive a lot of that onto screen.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, she was very much her husband's intellectual equal when they first met at their local university in Ohio, and she was also one of the first ladies to ever attend college to begin with. But she was editor of the school paper, and he was the nighttime custodian in order to pay his tuition. And yeah, when you read all the way that she herself wrote, and like she was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and outspoken, and just as progressive as her husband in many ways. And she didn't have the ability to vote for her husband, like the cruel irony of that political era. But it seemed like in her very, very short spell as first lady, which was actually even shorter than Garfield's tenure, because she contracted malaria very quickly after uh, entering into the White House, and was very sick for a lot of her time there. Um, but every indication seemed to point to her really advancing women's causes, had she been able to, stick around. And Betty is such a formidable actress of her own regard. I mean, there's just like she is incapable of being weak, right? Like she's just so strong. She has such a fire within her. So to be able to give her some of those scenes where she really gets to shine once her husband is shot, right? And she kind of has to step up and fill the void, both as her husband's fiercest advocate, but also this truth teller within the administration. Like she gets my favorite scene in the show, the scene that I'm proudest of, where she, in one of the last moments of the series, she visits Guiteau in prison, and uh, tells him that though he successfully destroyed her own husband's legacy, she will ensure that his legacy is destroyed as well. Which was, to give a monologue like that to Betty Gilpin, like a rare privilege as a writer.
No, it's such a fantastic scene in that episode as well. And in also talking about Garfield and Guiteau, it's interesting because you kind of expect them to cross paths a lot more
Yeah,
earlier on when you start watching it. But what's actually great about holding off when they finally do have a conversation and intersect more is that then as an audience, we kind of understand that sense of yearning that
yeah,
Guiteau has had, and just how combustible he feels and why he feels so emotional by the time this finally happens. Did you have a sense early on of where you wanted to place that in the story to build it in that way, or did that
Well,
come about
I
over
just sort of
time?
relied on the actual historical record. I took one liberty in that they meet three, well, I guess four times technically. They share the screen together. They wouldn't have actually shook hands in Chicago, although Guiteau's sister did live in Chicago, and he spent a lot of time in Chicago. I don't believe that he was actually there outside the convention when Garfield was nominated, but it felt like a really good opportunity to just sort of see their initial meeting. Um, in reality, yeah, Guiteau did get an audience of about 5 minutes with the president, as a lot of the other office seekers did. Garfield didn't seem to remember him afterward, really, and by all accounts, it was a kind of perfunctory, not particularly special meeting, which must have affected Guiteau in a major way because he built up Garfield in his mind as this hero to the common man, and then to just feel kind of underwhelmed coming out of that experience felt fascinating to me. But uh, Mike Shannon and Matthew McFadden barely got to know each other in Budapest because they shared so little screen time together. So that scene at the White House was one of Matthew's last days of shooting. And, he's spent the last 4 months as Guiteau begging, begging, begging to meet his hero. And then he finally gets this moment. And there's a line in the script that I think it's like his eyes start to glisten. I wrote in there and didn't really think much of it at the time. But Matthew gets there, and I don't know that if it was intentional or he just sat down across from Mike Shannon and just started getting really, really overwhelmed, and he just like burst into tears, like he does combust, as you say, and all of us just sitting there watching that day it took everyone off guard, uh, chiefly Mike Shannon, who had no idea what to make of it. Like that, his reaction is genuine, because we were cross covering them, and he just sees Matthew McFadden bursting into tears upon meeting the wizard finally, and he has no idea what to say to him. I mean, what do you say to this man? Um, yeah, it's such beautiful work from Matthew.
Yeah, because with Garfield, there's almost this ripple effect on every other character in terms of how does their interaction with him change them, and Guiteau goes one way, but talking about Chester Arthur, Nick Offerman's character again, he has a really profound effect on him, and he becomes arguably a much better person. And when he's eventually president, a better president as a result of that time. And so, how did you kind of go on those little like rabbit hole journeys of, well, each of these characters are changed in some way because of him, and what's that going to look like?
I mean, Garfield was such an inspiring figure that to see the effect that he has on the Chester Arthurs of the world just felt very satisfying from a dramatic perspective. And you do have to wonder, reading the historical record, right? Like, Arthur starts as chief crony of the spoil system, gets nominated for vice president, basically spends the entire vice presidency knifing Garfield in the back
Yeah.
over and over and over again. But once Garfield is shot, he has this big turn, and for the first time, really rebuffs Roscoe Conkling, the man that made him, and winds up imbuing a lot of the qualities that I don't think anyone ever expected him to imbue. But it's not hard to believe that Garfield rubbed off on him in some way. Like, he kind of rediscovers his nobility that he had early on in his career. In his 20s, he was a lawyer for the poor and the weak and the disenfranchised. But somewhere along the way, he kind of lost his soul, and so again, from just a dramatic point of view, to be able to watch Nick Offerman imbue this redemption arc, to be able to give him that, it was one of the most satisfying parts of the entire process.
Yeah, and in talking about the assassination towards the end of the show, and I was like, spoilers,
Mm.
the way that it plays out is so heartbreaking because we learn it wasn't the bullet that killed him, it was the instruments not being sterilized properly. And how did you find the way in which you wanted that to play out? Because you kind of go into this assuming, okay, the last 5 minutes is going to be the assassination, but it comes that little bit before so that you have all of that aftermath.
It happens about midway through Candace Millard's book, and she's, you know, very fascinated with medical science, and like she tends to gravitate toward more scientific leaning stories, and spent a lot of time profiling Alexander Graham Bell's role in the whole saga. Unfortunately, you know, he while he did develop the world's first metal detector, the induction balance, in order to hunt for the bullet in Garfield's abdomen. Ultimately, the experiment was a failure for a number of reasons. Um, yeah, it was the medical sort of series of errors. It's just so baffling and so horrifying by today's standards, and you kind of can't help but hate Dr. Bliss, Jelko Ivanek, who's an amazing actor. Um, but yeah, it very much just mimicked how I felt reading Candace's book. And in fact, I think we had to pull back from some of the more gruesome details because it just felt like a barrage of some of the most awful things you've ever seen inflicted upon a patient. Um, we didn't have a ton of time, a ton of runway to you know, really dig into all of that, but um, yeah, no, we it's pretty gruesome.
No, I love the way that you kind of found the pacing of that part of the story, especially, and
Yeah.
because I think it like hits even more in that result. And you've done such a great job with this series. So thank you so much for talking about it, Mike. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me.